Good morning. Today I have the pleasure to be with Peter Hazell, who is a professor from University of London, and we're going to be talking about the role of the future role of smallholder farmers and how they can contribute in making the world a better place. So, thank you very much, Peter, for granting this little interview. I'm going to start by asking you, do you think that smallholder farmers act naturally as entrepreneurs?
Very much so. Ted Schultz, a Nobel-winning, prize-winning economist, long ago demonstrated the rationality of smallholders, that given the constraints and the options that they are confronted with, that they do about as well as anybody can under those circumstances. And we have seen plenty of examples where, given new market opportunities, smallholder farmers are as aggressive entrepreneurs as anybody in taking advantage of those new opportunities. So yes, naturally they are natural entrepreneurs, but still there are challenges and there is need for support. The world that they face today is a very different one than earlier decades. The market chains are much more integrated, much more controlled by the private sector than in the old days they were controlled by the government. The input supplies, the credit and so on, all comes from the private sector these days. So interfacing with these new market chains, new input supply chains is much more challenging. You need much more business skills, and so there is a real need to provide training to today's small farmers. And then there are vulnerable groups, lots of women and disempowered groups who really need some support in organising to deal with these markets. And then we have the challenge of training tomorrow's young farmers.
So what do you think should be the role, or could be the role, of IFIs or donors to make sure that, to encourage them to become entrepreneurs if they're not, or boost their capacity?
Yeah, I think providing appropriate kinds of business training to farmers. I think especially encouraging and building up tomorrow's young farmers, but also working with disempowered groups, making sure that they don't get left out of these new market opportunities that are emerging.
Okay. Now, since they're entrepreneurs, how do you think they can take advantage of rising food prices?
Well, that's a two-edged sword, because many smallholders actually buy more food than they produce. So the net buyers, so as consumers, they lose a lot more from higher prices than they gain as farmers. So that's one challenge. But many smallholders will take advantage of higher food prices. After many years, growing food staples is becoming a little more profitable for many small farmers, so that is a new opportunity. But it takes more than price increases. They have to have the technologies, they have to be connected to the markets, and many of those things are missing. So price increases alone could mean higher food prices for them, but not real opportunities, because they don't have the means to increase production for the market. So we do have to work on the supply side to help them take advantage of this opportunity.
So what do we need to do?
This means more support for small farmers. In many ways, the more privatized systems of today are very much favour the larger farmer. It's an unlevel playing field for the small farmer. They just don't have equal access to credit and seeds and fertilizer and market outlets as the large farmer. There is a real role, not just for governments, but for donors and NGOs and the private sector to really try and level that playing field so they have more opportunity.
Now, how do you think they can contribute towards a solution for climate change?
Small farmers are not a major culprit by and large in climate change, apart from the smallholders who are encroaching into tropical forests, which clearly is something we need to get a handle on. Most smallholders are not the major culprits. They're some of the major victims of climate change. there isn't a lot they can do to mitigate climate change. There may be some new opportunities in the future if we can have carbon payment schemes, for example, that pay them to sequester carbon. That might be a way for some farmers to take advantage of climate change and help reduce some of the greenhouse gas emissions. But we shouldn't expect that to make much of an impact on a global scale. Be very tiny, for example, compared to the impact you and I could have if we were to downsize our cars a couple of grades. But I think the real challenge is helping small farmers adapt to climate change that many of them will face a more adverse and more volatile climate for their agriculture. They need to prosper within that changing context. So we have a real responsibility to help them adapt and to prosper at the same time. It's not just adapting to stay in poverty, they need to prosper despite climate change.
Okay. Now, do you think there are new dimensions to the debate over smallholder versus large farms within the context of growing food demand and climate change?
Yes, and I think particularly of Africa, that Africa has a tremendous opportunity now to contribute to world food security. They're a food deficit continent right now, but they have an average cereal yield of about 1 ton per hectare, and it's been that way for the last 40 years. They have the potential to double or triple their yield over the next decade or two. That means they could be producing an extra 100 million tons of cereals, which would make them an important player in world markets. They would be a surplus region. And a lot of people are seeing that potential. My dream is that African governments will work with their smallholders in exploiting that potential. The alternative that we're seeing that is beginning to emerge is that the big private players and foreign governments are beginning to see that potential, and you'll see large tracts of African farmland being taken over by foreign countries, by big international corporations who are going to develop that potential and exploit it, and they're going to leave all of Africa's smallholders out of it. So I think Africa faces a real choice on this one, and my hope is they're going to get organised and get their small farmers exploiting those opportunities quickly before it's too late.
Great. So my last question is, if you can share, if you give us one lesson that Africa can learn from Asia.
I think the most important one is that agricultural revolutions are not just technological revolutions. A lot of people think the Green Revolution was just that. It was a technological revolution, but it was enabled by a policy revolution too, that governments intervened in agriculture. For an agricultural revolution, it's not just a technology, but farmers have to have all the key inputs that go with that technology. They have to have access to markets. They have to have a favourable economic environment. There's a whole package of things that have to come together in an integrated way for an agricultural revolution to happen. In Asia, the policies were organised to that end. It turned out to be a very heavy-handed, state-dominated intervention. The government not only coordinated everything, but they supplied everything. And that's not the path for Africa. That coordination role, making sure everything comes together, is a very crucial one still. But you have to do it within a different institutional landscape today. It's not just the state that does it. It's the state working in close partnership with the private sector, with civil society, with farmer organisations, with donors. Together it can happen, but it does have to happen in a coordinated way. And I think that's one of the key lessons that Africa hasn't yet learned, or many of the donors are still looking for the magic technology bullet that's going to transform Africa without reforming the policies in any substantive way.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was a great pleasure.
My pleasure.